So learning to love literacy, and this first session I called The Power of Reading Aloud. And well, in South Africa at the moment, we're in a time where there isn't all that much power. We're feeling a lack of power. And so I felt that at least we could sit around a warm fire together, which I love. And also, I'm going to be talking about different kinds of power associated to reading aloud today. This is one of the more theoretical sessions. It's going to go behind why reading aloud is so important. And as we begin, I'd just like you to think back to the little you that you once were. Here I'm sharing with you the little me with my mom and my brother. And I was one of those little children who did have a lot of reading aloud when I was small. Probably that's why I'm I have such a passion for sharing its power. So think back to who you were as a little child, because really what we're trying to do here is think about how we can create the conditions that all young children need so that they can be in a position to learn to read and write powerfully and with meaning. So why should we be reading aloud to children? That's the question, really. So why should we be reading aloud to children? Let's have a look at some of the reasons that I think are really important. Because of the power of story, first and foremost. Here's Ben Okri, well-known Nigerian British writer. He talked about how if his mother wanted to make a point, she wouldn't correct me. She'd tell me a story, playing on my natural curiosity to figure things out. And there's the essence of the power of story, really. And it's also the magic of story for children, because it engages them and gets them figuring things out. And also it's at the heart of the question that we have now in South Africa and probably in other African countries. How do we bring back the educational power of story to education systems which have had that stripped away through colonial education and apartheid education? How do we bring back that power of story? So we want to read aloud because of that power, and also linked to that because of the power of holism and interconnectedness. As human beings, we need one another. We are not operating in little compartments. We operate in unified, collective ways. And another Nigerian, I seem to have chosen Nigerians today, Chinua Achebe, the famous writer, he talked about how compartmentalism is foreign to Africans, he was meaning. He said it's a world of men and women and children and spirits and deities and animals and nature and the dead. Our life was never compartmentalized in the way that it has become today. And I think that people all over the world are feeling this need to return to a more unified, holistic way of being, where we see the whole rather than having our lives chopped up into little pieces that ultimately don't make so much sense. And of course, this connects immediately into the kind of stories we tell, which are about life, and life is a whole. So Friedrich Brobel, who was another wise man, we'll get to wise women as well, in the 1700s, he was the inventor of the kindergarten movement, who actually started educating young children, and giving women the job of educating young children. He said, today, and this is in 1800s, the most urgent need in education is that schools should be united with the life of home and family. Now, of course, in terms of present day education systems across the continent, we also know that the links between home and school are incredibly significant for children and their learning. We also know how very difficult it is to establish those links. And this is again connecting into why reading aloud and why story is so important for children. Stories travel, they shift across contexts. So there's old Friedrich Brobel with his wisdom and the children behind him. We need to be reading aloud to children because of the power of meaning making. And here's Zimbabwean writer NoViolet Bulawayo, and she, in a story called Hitting Budapest, she really brings that message home, I think, to us. And we're all dealing with that issue of meaning. We've got the phrase, children must learn to read for meaning by age 10. We'll go into that more later on. But here is a little part in a story that she wrote, Hitting Budapest. It's about children, and these children are, they meet up with a woman who comes from Britain who's a photographer, and the photographer says, say cheese to these children. And the children, this little girl doesn't know what cheese means. She's thinking, what does cheese mean? And then it reminds her of the story that she was told of Dudu, the bird, who learned and sang a new song whose words she didn't really know the meaning of, and was caught, killed, and cooked for dinner, because in the song she was actually begging people to kill and cook her. So that's a very dramatic illustration of why meaning and meaning making is so significant at all stages of our lives, actually, as we're going to see. And then, of course, the power of imagination, because imagination can take us everywhere, places where we can't go to physically, but we have these imaginations. And this tale of Superman, out of this book, African Myths and Legends, there's the Superman who actually is not a very, well, he's quite a scary character. He's a cannibal, and he eats people. But anyway, there's this other woman who is at the well, and she meets Superman's wife. And Superman's wife's got her baby on her back. And the other woman had thrown a bucket down, and now she's really upset because she can't get the bucket out of the well, because the well's actually magic. And she says to Superman's wife, I threw the bucket down, but could not raise it up. I fear you will not be able to either. The woman laughed, that's Superman's wife, tied the child from her back and told him to pull the bucket out from the well. So this was a baby. He was on his mother's back. Without faltering, the child seized the rope in his little fat hands and pulled the bucket up as easily as if it had been a feather on the end of a piece of string. So there's the power of imagination. And also, I feel it also somehow gives us a way into the power of children again, because babies are capable of great things. And here are some beautiful faces, and I think you can guess what is happening with them from the expressions on their faces. And I think this is a kind of suggestion to us that if we want to know what to do with children to motivate them, we need to know our children. And here we can know from their expressions, I think you'll agree, that these children are enjoying themselves. So in terms of reading aloud with children. It is a way of giving children a wider perspective. And here, the author, who is Megan Cox-Gurdon, she says, children get a wider perspective when they're tugged out of the here and now for a little while each day. And that is what reading aloud can do for children. So I want to invite you for a moment now just to sit with me before this fire, this lovely warm fire, and I'm just going to read an extract from Credo Mutwa, who was one of the great fathers of storytelling in Africa. I just want to read a short extract, and for us all to sit before the fire and get warm with his words. The roaring, rain-drenched and lightning-torn night wears noisily on, and soon it's midnight. And now the storm holds its savage breath. A silvery star peers shyly through a gap in the scowling clouds, and near the great hut, just outside the door, comes the sound of a dog shaking water from its long, lean body. There is still the heavy, uneven sound of large drops from trees and the distant, continuous rumble of sheets of water exploring new channels of flow. There is the sound of fire sticks being briskly rubbed inside the darkened hut, and soon a shower of red sparks fall onto the small pile of dry grass in the center of the great sunken fireplace. A woman, yes, it is Mwani Wani, blows into the pile of grass. There is a glow and smoke, a sudden flicker and a burst of flame. Dry twigs are laid on top, and they are ravenously devoured. Heavy logs follow, and soon the whole interior of the hut is bathed in flickering light. So that's Credo Mutwa taking us into the story. And I hope that you all feel that you want to know what the story's about. We're not going to go into it now, but I urge you to try and find Credo Mutwa. He is, if you don't already know his work, because a huge part of what I think we need to be doing in order to be harnessing the power of reading aloud is to enlarge our own inner world of story. I think somebody's mic might be on there. Yes, but we'll go into that in another session. So I think there are two more powers. Because of the power of young children, we need to read aloud. We need to be reading aloud, not just read aloud occasionally, be reading aloud. From the moment they're born, human children are exceptional learners. Our brains are most active in the first few years of life. That's Alison Gopnik, who's a very well-known neuroscientist who's involved in children's learning. And that really takes us into the ultimate power that I want to refer to in this way today, which is the power of our biology, our own human biology, because all learning is based on the way our brains function. Okay, we all have these brains in our heads, and everything we learn is based in the way that our brains operate. And it underlines how babies and young children learn everything. And sometimes it feels as if we take textbooks, we take curricula, we take policies, we take all these things and we try and fit them to children without thinking about how children learn. And so you will come along with me now. Some of you might have already done this because I have talked about this quite a lot recently, but I'm going to talk to you about how important it is to understand a little bit about how our brains function so that we understand how best to get our children fired up like these warm fires that we're seeing on this PowerPoint. So here is a fetus. It's not even born yet. And there you can see glowing that brain. And what's very interesting about our brains is that they have evolved over time, and you can clearly see in the brain the stages of evolution. So we have this first bit, the reptilian brain, which is our instinctual brain. When we're scared, when we're frightened, when we're excited, when we're nervous, it's our oldest part of our brain that is working. And then we have our emotional or feeling brain, which was a later part of our evolution as humans. That's where our emotional systems operate. And then finally, the neocortex. The cortex is the newest part of our brain. It's our thinking, rational brain. And so all of our brains share some evolutionary endowed functions, and these are operating at such great speed that we never consciously aware of how they are functioning. Okay, but if we think about what is significant for early learning, I've thought about this a lot, and I've come up with 4 aspects which I think are really significant for early learning, and also particularly but not only for literacy learning and for reading, and so would be involved in reading aloud, and why reading aloud is important. So I'm going to look at them briefly. Experience and plasticity. So our brains are most active and hungry, as we said, in the first few years of life. And childhood is for learning, and that's what children are designed to do. And in terms of experience, we learn all the time from experience. That's all we've got, if you think about it. That is what we have, the experiences that happen to us or that we make happen. And in terms of children, the experiences that we create for the children in our environments. And when I say we, obviously, it's not only up to a parent or up to a caregiver or up to a teacher. There are far more greater influences going into our political and economic systems. But ultimately, we're all responsible for the experiences that children have, and our brains learn from experience, okay? They are structured for our survival. And if you look here, you can see how before a baby's born, how unbelievably the brain grows to fit inside that little head by 9 months when they're born. And then it continues in the first few years of life. There is this huge growth and huge learning that takes place. And we have these neural connections, which at birth look a bit like that. But with experience and with learning, these connections connect to one another and grow. It's like a forest, really, growing with branches and tiny bits connecting to each other. And the interesting thing is that these connections change all the time, and it is the changes in the connections that allow learning. And the other thing about it is that our brains are plastic, so that the changing is that plasticity working. But what we also know is that, so while the early years are these great years for all these connections to be formed, we can carry on learning all the way through our lives. That's why we always say it's never too early and it's never too late to start reading with children. But there is pruning that happens. And if you don't use connections that are set up in certain places in your brains, then they will wither. They do get pruned and they die. So it's not like everything is constantly happening. The first 5 years are particularly crucial. But as I said, we're all learning all the time from experiences. And the way that that happens is it's as if with an experience, we have a model that our brains create. And then another experience comes and we update the model based on what we found out and based on feedback. Okay. And feedback gives us what we need to know whether to keep that model or to alter it. Now, as I said, this happens very, very fast without our conscious awareness, but we are generating series of ever better approximations of what we need to understand. And think about learning to speak. Think about the young children in your lives that you have observed learning to speak. That feedback from the mother and others is what the baby uses to adjust their speech. We must remember that learning language is social. We aren't born with language inbuilt in us. If we were put into a forest with no people ever to talk to, we would not learn language. It would not happen. It's us. We're born with the propensity to speak, to use language, but we have to learn it socially. That's why we learn different languages. That's why we have different dialects that's why we speak differently. It's because of who we learn it from. So that feedback is what is so crucial. And actually, it's the same for learning to read and write. I argue that socially, culturally, we need the feedback from the adults, and we start with immature forms and we develop as we go along. Okay, but I'm not talking about writing now. So now let's get to the emotions. Remember, we looked at that the middle part of the brain, the emotional brain. We are all born with affective systems, affective emotional systems, okay? Now, these are what give rise to the emotions that we feel. And it's interesting, I touch here when I think about emotions. Our emotions are very embodied, aren't they? We have, scientists have discovered emotional tags that attach to all of our memories. We may not be aware of this, but sometimes our bodies tell us when something comes up that reminds us of an experience that was maybe positive or negative. We feel it. Sometimes it's music that reminds us. Sometimes it's a smell, sound. Our senses remind us. These emotional tags are very powerful. And these affective systems that we are born with shape all our brain functioning, and it uses neuromodulators. Well, I don't know what a neuromodulator is, but believe me, neuromodulators like dopamine, serotonin, which you will have heard of. Our nervous system carries these messages through our bodies, and this happens from birth onwards to support cognition, thinking, learning, and perception. And our emotional systems stimulate and guide all thought and learning. And if they're not functioning, thinking doesn't work. So you can think of stress, what stress does to thinking, okay? So that's part of our emotional system. Here's a lovely quote from MIM Fox, who's an Australian literacy specialist, early literacy specialist. She says, when a school reader, not a storybook, a reader is put in front of a failing child, everything becomes tense. Her body, her brain, her teacher, the situation, the very air itself. There's no fun left. There's no fun left anymore. No time for that. There's not much learning left either. The child is too petrified and turned off. And, I think that is something we all need to think about a lot. And the reading aloud story that we're talking about is intended as the exact opposite of this. It's to counteract this kind of phenomenon, which we actually know happens all too often for children in school. So for learning, the key affective systems, the main ones that I think are really important are one called the seeking system, the need to find meaning. It drives our need to find meaning. There's another one called the bonding system, okay? It drives our need to belong as social beings. And as it happens, as cultural beings, social cultural beings. And then the play system. We're born with the need to play, the need to rehearse and explore life, okay, and use symbols. Now, I'm going to look at the play system in more detail on another session. So that's why I put it in red, because I'm going to concentrate on these other two now. Okay, so here we are, talking about the need to find meaning, talking about reading aloud as, I would argue, a way into meaning, a way into deep meaning, a way into profound meaning. And we have the system, this affective system, which drives our need to understand the meaning of what's happening. So to question whether children should be able to read with meaning by age 10 is problematic, because all children, given the kind of opportunities that are nurturing ones and are appropriate ones for reading, should be able to read with meaning right from the very beginning. And that we see this happening with children who do get what they need. And there's no reason why other children shouldn't have the same. And that is why we need to be aware that we are born needing to find meaning. This little girl, it's just such a connected picture where you see her and the little bird, and you can imagine what's going on in her head. Who are you? What are you? And how did you come to be here? And why do you have wings? Why do you have feathers? Where do you live? We are born questioning our environment and trying to find answers to make us feel safe and to make us interested, to make our lives have purpose. So the power of personally meaningful activities, okay, and the problem of meaningless activity is something we need to think about. So, because meaningless activity gives rise to frustration, bad behavior, giving up, okay? And think about our children and what is happening with them when they're trying to learn to read. Yes, Kieran Egan, many years ago, saying that, and he wrote this great book called Teaching as Storytelling. I have it. I'm very happy to share bits of it with people if you're interested, and if you can't get hold of it. He talks about how a focus on exercises of sub-skills seems to encourage meaning and coherence to flee. This is talking about other parts of the world, not just South Africa and Africa. So, but there's some wisdom in there. And what he says is that the justification for reading, and we can take reading aloud, is simply ecstasy, the intoxication that can be achieved by stimulation and use of the imagination. If we cannot get students to experience this, then all the sub-skill mastery in the world will be a sterile achievement. That's what Kieran Egan says. And I think that this nudges us to be very aware of what we actually are doing with our young children. So that's the need for making meaning. Now, the need to belong. We actually are born with this affective system, so these systems come through into humans over time through evolution for our survival. They are what has made us survive over time and what makes us so successful. Our need to belong as social beings. We all need it. It's to do with our sense of belonging, of wanting to be part of a community, of having an identity, of being somebody who others care about. It's about our social and cultural practices. And very kind of firmly here, if you like, is the idea of that we as adults are the role models for our children as they come to belong in our communities and in our communities of practice, the kind of daily life things we do with them. They learn from us at our knees. We learn about cooperating and caring, and also to use language and communicate, because that's how we connect, isn't it? So this wonderful anthropologist called Barbara Rogoff has talked about how we learn by observing and pitching in. In a way, it's an apprenticeship idea of learning. People develop through their changing participation in the social and cultural activities of their communities, and these also change. And actually, when we started Nalibali, the reading campaign in 2012, this was at the heart of what we were trying to do. We were saying that if we want children to be motivated to learn how to read and write, then we have to think about how communities of practice inspire and influence them, and how reading culture develops. So here, reading aloud. This is actually from an American Pediatric Society, who have started all this reading in the United States for babies because they see it as so significant. Reading aloud creates everlasting bonds, creates the bonding, it creates the emotional connection when you're very young, makes it very easy later on. So I just want to flag here about digital communication, because here we are communicating across all kinds of digital divides, or I'm trying to communicate with you. And it does make it possible for us to stay connected, as Megan Cox-Gurdon says, with people we love far away, people we're connecting with. But she also makes the point, and I think this is very important, and we'll go into it on some other session. Unfortunately, the same technology has the practical effect of putting distance even between people who share the same home. And I'm going to share some research about the value of the screen as opposed to the value of reading aloud at another stage. Okay, now back to our brains and how they work. Our brains work by making predictions and recognizing patterns, okay? That's our cortex. It's an organ of prediction. I've heard it said I've read it somewhere. Our brains continuously predict. So that's like we guess in advance, looking for and using patterns to get meaning in economic ways. We must realize that there is so much information coming at us all the time that if our brains didn't have systems for being very economical and really just taking in what you really need, we just wouldn't be able to function. So there's this prediction. It's super fast. We have no idea it's happening, except for maybe sometimes you can think, how are you listening to me? I hope I'm being clear. But perhaps you're also anticipating what I'm going to say next. So our brains are doing that all the time, predicting what's going to happen next. And if you look at this, what's it called, a visual illusion, if you want to turn on your speaker and shout out what you see, feel free to. But otherwise, just in your head, what are you seeing?
Talking heads.
Talking heads, little Pac-Men, are you seeing?
A triangle in the making?
Yeah, okay, a triangle in the making. I'm hoping everybody sees a triangle, maybe. And as you look at that triangle, just remember that you would not be able to recognize a triangle unless you knew what a triangle was. So just to remind you about how we learn from experience, every experience counts. And there's the triangle. Our brain is filling in. This is the point. Our brain is filling in what is there from our prior experience of triangle or of little talking heads, if you like. The lines aren't there, but our brain can see it. Now, this is not an African book. This is a South African child, but the book is a very old story called The Tiger Who Came to Tea. Some of you might have come across it in secondhand shops or even had read it to children. It was published, I don't know when, long time ago in the 1980s. But here is a mother reading to a tiny little boy. He's under 2. I'm not sure exactly how old he is, but I feel that it helps one understand how prediction works a little bit. So I want you to listen to him and see if you can pick up what I mean by prediction happening.
Because he came this morning. Is that the milkman's card? What's that? Milk? Wow, that's the milkman. It can't be the boy from the grocer, because this isn't the day he comes. What's he writing?
A bike.
Yes, a bike. And it can't be Daddy because he's got his.
Yes.
Wow. We'd better open the door and see. Oh, Sophie opened the door, and there was a big, furry, strappy
Tiger.
wow. Excuse me, but I'm very
Hungry.
hungry. My tummy is empty. Do you think I could have some tea with you? Sophie's mummy said, come
I'm
in. So the tiger came into the kitchen and sat down at the
table.
wow, Carl, what can you see at the table? What can you see there? What's that?
The Sophie.
Okay.
That's Sophie.
That's this little guy reading. And, you know, I'm sure you noticed the mum sort of pausing all the time to let him come in with his predictions of what word was going to be there. I think we'll come back to talk about this little clip and other clips later on as we go along. But I felt that this kind of encapsulated that prediction. It also encapsulated a whole lot more. I don't know how we're doing for time, so I don't really want to stop now. But perhaps if you want to in the chat, note what you think you saw in that clip, especially about what we've been talking about this morning. Note it down, or if you have any questions about what you saw in the clip. But certainly that tiny little guy is picking up a lot of language as he goes along, as you can see as well. Okay, so it's the pattern of narrative. He's had that story shared with him a number of times. You can tell, can't you? He knows that story, and it is the pattern of narrative, the rhythm, the repetition, sometimes the rhyme that forms into this pattern that is so easy for our brains to grasp, especially in a very warm, nurturing kind of relationship situation. So whole chunks of meaningfully arranged texts are easier to remember. And that's why the wisdom of our ancestors, the lullabies, the songs, the rhymes, the stories, storytelling, that was how our brains could remember things back in time when we didn't have writing. And it is still the way that our brains remember things. Whole chunks get stored in short-term memory to avoid overload. And I'm just going to flag here that you can think then what happens when you get children having to memorize tiny little parts of language that don't actually mean anything to them. Remember the compartmentalization we talked about earlier on? Evolution shaped the mind for story, so it could be shaped by story. And that's Jonathan Gottschall in a book which I'll find and show you at another stage. But so our minds are shaped for the pattern of story. That's the key message here. So what makes story so powerful neurologically in our biology, in our bodies? How does it work? The story format releases neurotransmitters in the brain. Cortisol, which is a stress hormone, during a story's tense parts, that promotes focus. Cortisol can also be very negative if there's too much of it. Oxytocin, the feel-good hormone, that's a hormone released when you have babies, when you're breastfeeding. It promotes connection and empathy. That's our biology. That is what is happening when we have a story, okay? So there's a physical thing that's going on, physical as well as mental. So here's a quick case study. I know that we're drawing to the end of our time. For half an hour, there were children in an intensive care unit who were actually in pain. They were very badly ill children, because otherwise you're not in an intensive care unit. And what happened was that there was this experiment done to look at storybooks being shared with them versus riddles being solved with them. So an adult got with two groups. One group had storybooks shared for about half an hour. The other had riddles that they were doing together. And what happened was, before and after, the researchers measured the oxytocin, that feel-good one, and the cortisol levels, the stress one, and they measured the pain levels of the children and how they felt about being in the hospital. Okay, so they did that before the intervention, the story reading and the riddles, and after. And both the stories and the riddles made the children feel better, but the story group had twice as much of the feel-good hormone, the oxytocin, and twice as much decrease in stress in their saliva. They measured it through the saliva. The children said they felt less pain, and they said they felt okay in the hospital, in this intensive care unit. The ones who had the story read to them felt better. So story reading improves mood and eases pain in the short term. That's what the results of the study arrived at. So that is very powerful, I would say. So in conclusion, what feels good? We all know, because we're not that different from that little child that we once were. We want to do again and again. And that is the power of story. And that is what we're going to go into far more next time, practically into the storybooks. But just to sum up, our brains process narratives in a way that transports us into the world of a story, and we connect emotionally with the events of the story. And I'm going to end there, and hopefully there's time for a bit of conversation or questions.
Thanks very much. Thanks very much, Carol. There've been a lot of comments as we've gone along, people popping in their own experience of many of the things you're talking about, so that's great. I do have a question which relates to the clip particularly, and so the question is, how important is it in that clip that the mother seems to be reading to the child in a language that they share? So they seem to be sharing the home language. How important is that to the sort of success, as it were, of the event? And then also, what would have happened if perhaps she didn't have access to a book that was in a language that they both spoke? How might she have created a shared reading moment for them using a book that was in a different language? So if you could just respond to those, please.
Yes, so we are going to go into multilingual situations and not just English or not just one language in future sessions. But if one just takes that clip, yes, and that cultural practice, which clearly is something that they're both very comfortable doing, and they are speaking in the language that they both share. Now that is significant because obviously the meaning making that we were talking about, the meaning making is just happening there because, I mean, although it's a baby, the baby does understand some of the story. Obviously, a tiny baby, a tiny child, he's more of a toddler, doesn't understand nearly as much as the mother does because he doesn't have the experiences that the mother has had with life and with language. However, they are creating shared meanings there because they're both using the same language. And we're all very aware that in our situation, often we don't have the same language. And maybe, say, for example, I'm a Xhosa-speaking mother and my child is Xhosa-speaking, and this is the book that lands up with us and it's not in isiXhosa. Well, we could talk for several hours about this, actually, but let's just think about the language part of it at the moment, not the images part. So we can still, well, actually, we have to think about the images, because what I want to say is we can still talk about the images. We can enjoy the book, we can share the book, we can make something out of the event. However, what we can't do is start introducing the child to the way that our language looks in print. And that is one of the key early concepts of print that children need to develop. So as they have stories shared with them, they start understanding that it's the words on the page that mean something. So that can't happen when you're not using a book with a language that you both share. You can use the visuals and you can retell your own story. And as you can see, when a child is very young, usually you're trying to get some kind of rhythmical, repetitious thing going, because remember the sort of the pattern of language you need to get going in the visuals, with the visuals of a book that the child doesn't, that you don't have the language to use. Of course, we always want to try and find books, a mixture of books, and we definitely want to have books where the images are relevant and appropriate for the child as well. So that's a whole nother issue that we'll go into. I don't know. I don't think that fully answers your question, but it hints at it, Arabella.
Yeah, I think it does. Thanks very much. And of course, yeah, we will pick up on some of those themes again in later sessions.